Before we start with the development of democracy and capitalism during the 19th century in America, we need to define these variables in order to understand the further information about each region in this continent. Capitalism, or earlier called by Adam Smith, a Scottish social philosopher and political economist, in The Wealth of Nations as the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. In social terms, it is based on the principle of individual rights. Politically talking, is the system of laissez-faire, an economy when all that is applied to the sphere of production. The result is free market, and most other means of production are privately owned. Once Abraham Lincoln, U.S. President, defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people, but before him this term came from the Greek language and means ruled by the simple people. Democracy is a form of government based on a constitution ensuring basic human and political rights, freedom of opinion, religious liberty, and fair and free elections.
The independence of Brazil comprised a series of political events that occurred in 1821 to 1824. In Europe were the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution that affected Brazil. Because France invaded Portugal, the King John VI moved to Brazil. He did many reforms to raise Brazil to the same level as Portugal. John's son, Dom Pedro, was named regent, and in 1822, Pedro proclaimed the independence of Brazil. After the abdication, Dom Pedro left his son in 1889, Pedro II as emperor. He was deposed on the same year by a Republican General Deodoro Fonseca. The country's name became the Republic of the United States of Brazil. From 1889 to 1930s, Brazil was formally a constitutional democracy. In 1891, the first Republican constitution was created. The presidentialism was adopted as form of government. After the Industrial Revolution in São Paulo, it began a period of industrialization, and the coffee production in Brazil gave the transition to capitalism. The economics and business took a new direction. They moved towards monopolies, and the technology sparked industrial growth. A lot of Italian immigrants came to Brazil and they began new business. The slavery abolition in 1888 opened the door to new works and free competence.
The ideas and practices that led to the development of the American Democratic Republic owe a debt to the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, but also the ideas of the French Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th century, with ideals like liberty, justice, and equality strongly influenced the American revolutionaries. The two ways that democracy expanded in the 19th century were the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage. In 1800, the United States had the most liberal suffrage in the world, but still only white men who owned property could vote. States slowly chipped away at requirements. Two crusades stood out above all others because they highlighted the limits of American democracy: the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. Another process that developed democracy in the USA was the Civil War, because during this, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, by which enslaved African Americans in the South were declared free, and it also established a stronger federal government. After the war, 3 amendments to the Constitution banned slavery throughout the country and granted political rights to African Americans. Under the 15th Amendment, African American men won the right to vote, but some were still prevented. Then, in the 19th Amendment in 1920, women got the right to vote. This was important for democracy because voting is something we can't miss if we're talking about it. Actually, American citizens that are 18 or older have the right to vote. The United States has the strongest democracy in the world and is not weakened by corruption like other regions in America. It is governed by the two-party system where there are only 2 major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The American economy became predominantly capitalist only by 1900. The early years fall into 3 periods. After the Civil War, the U.S. grew to lead the world in industrial and agricultural production. A special combination of factors made this possible, including political stability, private property rights, a free enterprise system, and an expensive supply of land and labor supplied mostly by immigrants. Finally, a growing network of transportation and communication technologies aided businesses in transporting resources and finished products. American economic growth in the second half of the 19th century was the fastest in history. producing rapid rises in production, wages, and personal wealth. Most of this wealth, of course, was facilitated by capitalism. America's economic successes came not from government policy but from private capital and investment.
Between 1973 and 1988, Chile was governed by an authoritarian military regime led by General Augusto Pinochet. Repression against opponents, mostly on the left, was harsh, and thousands were tortured or killed. A new constitution in 1980 imposed severe restrictions on political parties and placed most power in the hands of the military president. Through coalition, the National Accord for a Full Transition to Democracy was the principal civil society force that used nonviolent means to press for gradual democratization and liberalization, including an end to restrictions on civil liberties and free and open elections. Democrat Patricio Aylwin assumed the office of the presidency after winning open elections held in December 1989. Since that time, Chilean democracy has consolidated and the country has become a successful political and economic model for Latin America. According to the Chilean scholars Javier Martinez and Álvaro Díaz, it is a fallacy that the return to democracy in Chile was the result of free market reforms.
Venezuela in the 19th century following independence did not experience one continuous civil war. As in human affairs everywhere, patterns of political ascendancy, downfalls, and resurgences developed. Following the Venezuelan War of Independence, Venezuela initially won independence from the Spanish Empire as a part of Gran Colombia. From 1829 to 1899, Venezuela had 30 presidential terms. A mere 16 presidents served a total of 28 non-transitional terms, and at least 30 insurrections occurred, albeit most of them unsuccessful. We can divide the history of Venezuela in the 19th century into the following periods. The ascendancy of José Antonio Páez. He ruled either as president or as the man behind the throne from 1830 to 1846, and later from 1860 to 1863 as a dictator. During his first year in office, Páez created a three-man office of foreign relations within the Ministry of Finance. The Monagas ascendancy. They broke with a conservative party, but both brothers governed as liberals. José Gregorio abolished slavery in 1854, and José Tadeo abolished capital punishment. Federal War from 1858 to 1863. Castro was a military president. During his presidency, there was a proliferation of aspiring caudillos in Caracas itself, and he exiled them all. This was what provoked the Great War of Caudillos, also called Guerra Federal or Federalist War. The Federalist period, from 1863 to 1870. Venezuela was a country of peripheral enclaves, defined by ports through which international commerce was carried on. These enclaves were the source of customs revenues, which, with some foreign loans, were the main fiscal resources of the Venezuelan government in the 19th century. The Antonio Guzmán Blanco ascendancy from 1870 to 1888. He was good at progressive legislation and declared education free and obligatory for all. He did build the railroad from Caracas to Valencia and tried in other ways to modernize the country, but the facts were stacked against him. The political stability of Venezuela was principally the doing of his principal lieutenant. The civilian presidencies and the Crespo ascendancy from 1888 to 1899. Under Crespo, Venezuela experienced an international crisis in what became known as the Venezuela crisis of 1895. The tradition of indirect elections through local councils will last in Venezuela until 1945.
Peru had no viable system in the 19th century. It had government by oligarchs and the military. Its history was complicated by 3 foreign wars. All of it was lost. In the War of the Pacific, since 1879 to 1883, Peru lost the nitrate-rich province of Tarapacá. That meant the loss of nitrates and money it brings. In the 1840s, saw a boom in guano, that was bird droppings, exports which people bought for fertilizer. By the 1870s, the value of guano exports reached 100 million, a lot of money for Peru. The guano trade also meant foreigners and railroad building. Peru was lighthearted about foreign credit, thinking that it could borrow all it wanted and pay the debts with guano. To mine the guano, Peru imported Chinese laborers. In the 19th century, the country experienced very small industrial development with a small spurt of activity in the 1890s. This development occurred before the country could sustain them. Ramon Castilla, the dominant figure from 1845 till 1861, tried to clean up the finances. He abolished ecclesiastical privileges. He partially abolished involuntary peonage. These liberal measures did not break the system. Most presidents were military men in the first 50 years of independence. Peru had 40 revolts. The liberals created the Civilist Party, dedicated to civilian government in the 1870s. 1879, Peru entered the War of the Pacific, which lasted until 1884. Bolivia invoked its alliance with Peru against Chile. The Peruvian government tried to mediate the dispute by sending a diplomatic team to negotiate with the Chilean government, but the committee concluded that war was inevitable. Chile declared war on April 5th in 1879. Almost 5 years of war ended with the loss of the department of Tarapacá and the provinces of Tacna and Arica in the Atacama region. In 1889, the external debt was 45 million, but annual revenue was less than 7 million. That meant that there was no money for economic development. In 1890, the foreign creditors organized the Peruvian Corporation in London. Finally, Chile committed to a referendum for the cities of Arica and Tacna to be held years later in order to self-determine their national affiliation. However, Chile refused to apply the treaty, and both countries could not determine the statutory framework. Therefore, direct negotiations between the parties led to a treaty, that was the Treaty of Lima in 1929, in which Arica was ceded to Chile and Tacna remained in Peru. But then Tacna returned to Peru on August 29th, in 1929. The territorial loss and the extensive looting of Peruvian cities by Chilean troops left scars on the country's relations with Chile that have not yet fully healed. After the War of Pacific, an extraordinary effort for rebuilding began. The government started to initiate a number of social and economic reforms in order to recover for the damage on the war. Political stability was achieved only in the early 20th century.